it had, I mean, it's been a while since we've talked about this topic, so I like that Cole brought this one up because it has been a while. And I think, Cole, this is the last time we spoke about this was when you were like a guest, were you not? Like it was kind of like your guest and then you joined the panel.
Yeah, it seems like server-driven UI just anchors me to this podcast. When I first started, it was like just learning about it, and now I'm just like, whoa!
Well, yeah, so as Cole just basically alluded to is we are going to be talking about server-driven UI, and we've given perspectives on this, probably about a year or two ago. Like I lose track of time, so I can't remember. I should look up to see exactly which episode it was. But yeah, we did this topic, and I think it's worth revisiting. And to this time, we actually have Sherman Chen joining us, who's a senior software engineer at LinkedIn, which you're very familiar with some server-driven UI at LinkedIn. And I think this is a great topic for us to kind of discuss. And like, it's been around long enough, anything with any trends that we see, it's cool when you actually revisit something that's now been around a while and see like, is this actually working? Is it scaling? Is this still the right thing to be doing? Sherman's laughing, so I'm like really curious to know what's going to happen now. But yeah, Sherman, before we dive in, can you give a brief introduction of who you are, what you do, and what your favorite happy hour beverage is?
Yeah, hey everyone, thanks for having me. I'm Sherman. I'm currently a software engineer at LinkedIn. I work on the web platform, linkedin.com. And I think I spend most of my time working on something called LinkedIn Pages. You can think of it as like a profile for a company versus an individual. And I think I try my best to make LinkedIn a good experience for any user or visitor.
I like that motto. That's good. Yeah, keep making it great. Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, and then my favorite happy hour beverage. I am hopelessly addicted to Coke Zero. I think I
Coke Zero.
Yes.
Okay, all right. I should let you finish that. How many do you drink a day, Sherman?
Like I'm trying to limit myself to 2 a day. Which I've been somewhat good with. Today, I haven't drank any because apparently it's National Boba Day. So I actually have with me a milk tea.
I wish I knew it was National Boba Day. That kind of feels like I wish I had that. Jem, do you know this? I feel like that's something
I didn't know it, but I did have boba.
Nice.
So, yes, I did do that. I'm cool.
It was planned. I love it.
Sherman texted me today.
That's so good. All right. Well, let's also give introductions of today's panelists. Augustus, you want to start it off?
Yeah, sure. I'm Augustus. I'm a software engineer at Twitch.
Ooh, X now is what we're calling it, Augustus. All right. Cole.
My name's Cole. I'm a current software engineer at Netflix.
Jim Young, engineering manager at Netflix, and we are currently knee-deep in STUI, so this should be a good topic.
This will be a good one. And I'm the host of Front End Happy Hour, Ryan Burgess. I'm also Netflix engineering manager there. I'll follow suit with Augustus' intro. Clerk has been nice enough to help support Front End Happy Hour podcast and sponsor this episode. I'm looking at you get complete user management with pre-built UI components for sign in, sign up, user profiles, and organizations. The authentication is MFA, SSO, magic links, SMS, and bot detection. Clerk provides helpful SDKs for modern frameworks such as Next.js and React. Seamless integrations with popular databases. Even Clerk's free tier offers up to 10,000 monthly active users, and you never pay for a user's first day. Everything you need to authenticate and manage your users, freeing you up to focus on building. Let's dive in. You all, a server-driven UI. Maybe we should start, maybe not everyone has listened to that first episode. Who would like to give a rough definition of what server-driven UI actually is? And, just to kind of get that level set before we dive in. I'm looking at Cole and Sherman for this one. I think they had their fair share of server-driven UI.
How dare you? You're saying engineering managers can't explain server-driven UI. How dare you?
No, I already know this. It's like, I feel like you and I can do the high level, Gem. Like we'll give actually maybe that's how you start is like give the high level. And then it's like, the engineers will be like, well, you kind of messed these little details up, or you should have talked about this too. You kind of missed that. So, maybe I'm just going right to the source on this one, Jem.
Oh no, you're 100% right. They are more qualified than me. I'm just saying, I'm personally offended that you think
I'm
that.
with you on it. It's okay, Jem. You can hold that against me.
What I can say is server-driven UI, if done wrong, what I've heard is it is what UI development, or it is what a backend engineer thinks UI development is like without ever having done UI development.
All right.
A lot.
Yeah. Actually, even like you took the negative side on it, but I'm like, okay, I'm following. Is that it's like, yeah, if you were explaining how something's rendered to, a backend engineer, that's probably a good way to like simplify it. Is that kind of what you're getting at, Cole, too, of a saying?
Yeah, I actually really like this definition. As somebody who has shifted from front end to back end, back to front end, when I think about UI development as a back end engineer, you're often thinking about contracts and what the contracts look like for UI. And it's scary.
So it's UI rendered on the server, and yes, I think that's a good start. I like that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, wait. What?
That was pretty vague. UI rendered on the server, that doesn't. I don't know.
That's fair.
And wavy for me, and SDY is very misunderstood.
Especially on our second episode about SDY. I feel like on our first episode we kind of hand waved, but on this episode we should get down into it. Like, when you talk about server-driven UI, you're always ending up talking about how you build UIs anyways, and it feels like, if you remember from last episode, Jem was talking about thick clients versus thin clients and how it just always goes in circles. So now,
thank you for reminding me of that, Cole. Like, I've already forgot what we talked about. So thank you.
Yeah. So now, I guess my question to folks in this room, having been through this 2 or 3 times now, what have we learned since then? Like, what we know what it is, but what have we learned? I don't know.
I think what I learned personally is that despite your best efforts, there is still going to be fragmentation. At the end of the day, each platform has its own core respective way of doing things, and it's very hard to build this unified experience that's agnostic and supposedly adaptable to X platforms in the future. But as long as you approach it from kind of like an earnest view and you work together, it's like a good way to start a conversation about how to build these nice UI experience without like kind of like dropping coverage for one or the other platform.
Maybe to even go back a little bit too, because I think like I like the question and the way you're answering it, Sherman, but it made me also realize is like maybe even what Jem was getting at is like us defining it better. It's like maybe even starting at like, what are some of the benefits that you would want to go to, right? Like starting back to like, this was a year or 2 ago that we were talking about this, is like, why were people thinking, hey, server-driven UI, this is a direction that we might want to go? Like, what are some of the benefits that you would get from it?
I'm down to try to give my very bad definition. Yeah, I'll just be straight up honest. I don't think I've done server-driven UI to the degree that other folks have done it. So I would love if I could just try to give a definition and then someone could correct me, because the one thing is every company does things differently. So yeah, my understanding of what server-driven UI is, you think of that typical front-end app, React, whatever, because we're all front-end happy hour, sure, why not? Usually the relationship is the client, React app, is requesting data from somewhere. And from that data on the client, you're figuring out what to render. And my understanding of what server-driven UI is there are a lot of use cases where it's better for the server to kind of make that determination. And it can be as like simple as it tells you what the client should render, or it could be even as extreme as the server literally just gives you smack dab, hey, literally render this. Like, and I've seen like different granularities of that. It could be like, here are the components and props, and you just literally shove it in, and in the app, you can imagine in the front end app, it's like literally, okay, I'll take this component name, I'll figure out what component to pull, and here are the props in this JSON object. I'll just shove them in a JSON spread, and call it a day. there's like that granularity. There's like literally like taking HTML and just slapping it in an iframe. That's like more extreme. And does that sound right? Am I totally
I
on
loved your
point or off base?
explanation. No, I think you did a great job of thinking about ways in which you can do it and just kind of the whole essence of like what you're trying to achieve with it. I don't know if there's anything else anyone else wants to add, but I thought that was.
Can I? So I'll take my manager explanation here as the least qualified person. So just like Augustus said, and traditionally, when you're building UI, the logic and the UI code are controlled by the client. So server-driven UI is essentially saying, actually, the server controls what UI is rendered. And that's like the short definition. What that means traditionally is when we build user interfaces, what we're trying to achieve, especially if you're talking about multi-platform. So we're trying to achieve parity across all these so we have a consistent experience. So that means that could be across one platform like a web. It could be mobile, Android, whatever it is you're trying to build. You're always trying to build like this same experience for everybody that use your application. The promise of server-driven UI is, well, instead of having an Android engineer, an iOS engineer, and 3 web engineers trying to build the same experience and trying to make this parity, how about we have one unified way of describing UI on the server, and then it's up to each platform to interpret that into their own individual specifications. So that gives you the idea of like you can technically universally scale any UI to any new platform by having like this one language to describe all of these things. And the bonus you also get is you don't have to ship a new client when you want to change the UI because it's all described on the back end. So like on the web, not as big a deal because we can ship stuff all the time. It's pretty much a new client now on every load. But on mobile, you get a lot of power there because you don't have to go through like the Play Store and do the rigorous updates and all these things. You can control all that on the server. So that's like the theory and the promise of server-driven UI. But the execution, it turns out to be very, very complicated. It's a good idea, but it's the details that is why we get paid a lot of money to figure out these problems.
Well, I think Jem, like your add on there and like the selling point of like the mobile clients is a great example of that and like why it's so beneficial. But I think what we're all alluding to here is like that was the sell. Like we're like, yeah, that sounds great, and that's something that likely would work, and we could definitely get leverage of doing this. Now, what we're kind of recircling back to is like, yeah, that was kind of the promise, but are we getting it? And kind of the answer is like, it's complicated. It's more complicated than I think people thought. So I'm curious, like, especially for those who are a lot more familiar with it, similar to Jem, I was a manager through a lot of this. Yeah, like, what was your experience? Like, what was hard? What was like things that you just didn't expect or account for?
I think one of the hardest things is trying to envision how a platform works from almost like an entirely, like, let's say like a text-based approach. I'm sending you JSON, but this JSON has to represent not just the look of your app, but how users are actually going to interact with and eventually navigate throughout the application. So it gets hard to start trying to model actions when they're text-based. And then how do I store state? Like, because my servers, or now that my UI is sent from the server, like ideally I don't go back and ask for things, and ideally I never store state on a server. That's kind of like a big no-no, right? So how do I start representing this state of my client when I only like make one initial trip to the server to get back supposedly this like holy grail of the layout, the actions and everything? I know one way that LinkedIn's been leveraging thing is kind of keeping a lot of state in query params. It is it's a challenge, but it's one thing that's kind of universal in a sense that like the way a URL is constructed, it's the same across a web browser, across a mobile phone, across a tablet, etc. And then from there you can kind of figure out, hey, it's like which page am I navigating to? When that navigation happens, how does my respective like platform stack history work? If I need to show a widget or a component, but I don't necessarily want to push a new frame on the stack, how can I like demonstrate, like how can I keep track of that within each like client? So then maybe that's when a query param would be leveraged. And then I think probably most challenging is how do I handle deep linking? Deep linking is it's a challenge on its own. And then now once I'm like trying to integrate all this like server driven UI, I don't know how exactly a user enters my application, and by the time they enter a specific view or route, what's available. Yes, I think just in my experience, those are some of the more challenging problems.
Sherman, I'm actually glad you brought up the query param route. Augustus, it kind of made me remember a lot of things that we were doing at Evernote was doing, not necessarily for server driven, but I mean, a lot of it was a PHP application or a Java application. And that was a lot of the problem too, is we were trying to interact with different teams and platforms. And so sometimes it was very much, you could send a lot of the data and even signals to change the UI in a sense, just through query params. And it got complicated though. Like, I think that's, probably Sherman, you felt this too, is like simple when you're doing 5-6 things, and then you start adding more and there's more complexity. And then each team has to understand those handoffs. And, there's all this documentation that comes along with it. It's not bad, but it just continues to get more complicated as it's trying to scale. That to me is like, it makes so much sense. I'm like, yes, parameters, that's simple, and that will be great. That's easy. But it's the scale part. Am I wrong? Like, Sherman, is that like really where it got to you all, is like just getting harder with as it scaled?
Oh, you know what? I think my worst fear is that one day I somehow think of the exact same query param as an engineer on some entirely different team, and we both use it, and now the page has no idea what to show because you can only have one query param mapped to a certain action, as far as I know.
Yeah, and it will take the last one, right? Like, it will take, like, if you have like A equals 1 and A equals 2, it's going to equal 2. It's the last one that shows. So yeah, you're right.
It's so funny hearing this, because what I'm hearing from Sherman, I kind of hear from Jem, from everyone, when it comes to server-driven UI, the two kind of key parts where it becomes challenging is when you have to do anything interactive. If you're doing anything beyond just presenting to the user, it gets more challenging because you're modeling a part of the UI interaction that hasn't been done in the client before, where the user is coming back to the same session. And that's when we're dealing with state. The second kind of challenging issue that is being talked about right now is server-driven UI isn't one design language. It's really what the UI design language means to you. So getting Ryan and Sherman to agree on one language to describe UI, then getting them to do it across platforms, then getting them to do it across features, getting one version of Netflix, for example, in server-driven UI is impossible, because you'll never get engineers even to agree on tabs versus spaces. How are you going to get them to agree what an action should look like?
Oh, the meetings too. Like, Jem and I are going to be in those meetings trying to discuss and figure this out for like other teams and partnering with teams. Is like, well, you got to agree on this. And like, there's so much complexity in that. Just the handoff. There's no coding right there. That is just like literally conversations about how to do that.
And I will say, like, the biggest problem I see is everybody wants to run a marathon at the gate. Nobody wants to do anything incremental or build on top of what they already have. Everybody always wants to design a full language, a full DSL, and that takes time and a lot of investment.
Yeah, to build on my experience with server-driven UI, it comes down to build something from scratch, you have to first invent the universe. And coming back to server-driven UI, like, we forget the stuff that like Sherman was just talking about, like routing or server state, things that are very solved problems. You have to you like essentially reinvent those problems, and you have to solve them universally across every platform or what's going to be supported by server-driven UI. That's always underestimated, that complexity of engineering. And then, like Cole was saying, trying to get people to agree on one unified solution, even though it looks foreign to whatever native platform. Like, if you're a React developer, it's going to look weird. If you're a Kotlin developer, it's going to look weird. So trying to get like these disparate viewpoints to align on one thing is incredibly challenged. And it's funny. I hate to say, like, sound like a manager, but all these things like boil down to organizational problems and not necessarily engineering problems. And like I really hate saying that, but it's true. A lot of server-driven UI that I've seen be successful or not successful is down to the organization and communication and leadership versus it's a really tough engineering problem. It is, but it's solvable. It's been done plenty of times, but getting that alignment takes a lot of work, like you're alluding to, Ryan. So and Cole kind of alluded to this as well. The failure that I've seen consistently is not scoping your server-driven UI implementation down to saying like, this is what it is and this is what it's not. Because like you said, you can grow it infinitely because it's such a powerful tool. And once I think engineers grok onto that, they're like, oh, I can do this and build this. And it's like a really tempting problem to go after versus someone saying, no, this is what the boundaries are and we're not going to exceed that. And again, that's an organizational problem, not an engineering one.
Yeah, so I mean, Jem, you and I need to take the blame on this one as managers. It's our fault always. But I think too, what's interesting here is that like what you said there too is like it's almost like some really great advice is if you're going down the route of server-driven UI, actually any technology is like setting the boundaries of like why are we using this and being really upfront, like what are the benefits, what are we truly needing this for, and like hold yourselves accountable to not just shove everything in there. We've made that mistake with so many things. Like it's not just server-driven UI, you name it, a framework, anything out there, we've made this mistake before.
I feel like it often comes from boiling the ocean, Ryan. Like this mistake you're talking about, it's like we're talking about doing too much too fast. With server-driven UI, it's almost always better to start with just one step from where you are. You move your contract to the server, describe your component in a contract, and ship it. But if you spend all day designing the one perfect language, like Jem says, which often teams do, they never actually ship to market. They never actually get one feature across platforms. And that's the problem, is like you actually have to ship something. So it's almost always better for one engineer to go and design something that at least works and prototype it, and then get that on one platform. Once it's on one platform, you've shipped more than most server-driven UI teams ever have.
Wait, so we never got to the goal or the benefit that we had set out to do of like shipping to multiple platforms, is what you're telling me, Cole?
I mean, it depends on where you are. Like, I think in different companies, I've seen them combine multiple systems. I've seen different companies just say, this is the system for the web and this is the system for mobile. You got to find what works for you.
That's hard.
This kind of sounds like
that's hard.
The bell on a cat problem. You know, we're like, all the mice scatter and they're like, oh, there's a great idea to know when a cat's coming. We'll just put a bell on it and then we'll hear it coming and everyone's giving each other high fives. Oh, we've solved the problem. We're never going to be hunted again. And then one mouse says, wait a minute, who's putting the bell on the cat in the first place? Yeah. But I do really agree with Cole's point, which is one really powerful thing about SDUI is that you don't need like wholesale adoption from scratch. You don't need to recreate the universe. You can definitely do a like progressively make it part of your app. For starter, you know, like we talked about how one of the more challenging parts is interactivity. So maybe let's not start with that. Let's start with just doing some views, you know. I think one case was from my understanding, I think Lyft implemented SDUI in their mobile apps and their web app. Well, let's just say their app. Not that we're platform agnostic supposedly, but the first use case they had wasn't necessarily an interactive one. It was just to display messaging. I think it was during COVID. They wanted to display safety banners. And, you know, they wanted to make sure they could get this across all their applications without going through a review cycle, because it's kind of like a public health emergency. So, you know, like there's definitely times to just incrementally adopt it versus trying to just recreate an entire new feature or recreate your entire app with an SDUI program.
I'm trying hard not to laugh because it seems like SDUI is most successful with email, and that's kind of ironic.
You know, like a lot of people
and messaging.
Yeah, I think a lot of folks I've talked to, and broaching the topic of SDUI, at some point, someone's going to chime in, isn't this just HTML?
Well, pretty much. I mean, Augustus said that. Yeah.
Like everything you're describing isn't the problem. Like this is literally HTML. You just want it in a phone.
But I think also, Sherman, I think it gets back to like some of the goals or promises of it was that it was more like, no, we'll write one UI and all the interactions, everything. It will just be, and it will get delivered to all those devices, all those platforms without you having to really worry about it. You just write once and it works everywhere. I think we've been promised that many times, and it's just not true. It's like maybe 80% of it is like write once if you're lucky, but we all know that last 20% is hard. It's not easy to do that, and I think that's the complexity that's coming along with SDUI is that it is complex. It seems simple. You're just rendering HTML. Oh, we've done this before. We were good at this. But it was overcomplicated too. I think that's like, it was simple, but overly complicated.
It's like, I've been on this rant before. It's like design systems. Design systems are a great idea. Why, instead of inventing 12 buttons, we have one unified way of presenting UI components across an org or business, whatever it is? Great idea. Why do design systems fail? Organizational problem. Like it takes discipline to like say, we're not going to build outside of these. Design, you're bound to these constraints. UI engineers, you're bound to use these components and not try to modify them for your own case. Product managers, you have to work within these constraints. Like good engineering takes discipline, and that's something it's really hard to impart on people. Versus like, oh, I see a really hard problem, let's go solve it.
That's hard.
So like server-driven UI design systems, they're kind of all the same. That's the same bucket of like, yeah, they're really good, really challenging and really powerful tools with a really narrow scope. And like Sherman and Cole already talked about, like email, good one. Pop-ups, interstitials, great use of server-driven UI, really crisp. It's a really well-established pattern. The minute you step outside that, it's going to cost you more. And the power's there, but again, it's just going to take more discipline to say like, this is what we're going to do, this is what we're not going to do. I don't care who's listening, or like, no one's going to change my mind on that. And then it can be successful, but that's hard. That's really hard.
Well, I think it's like, Jem, basically what you're saying too is like, it's like pick the tool for what it's good for kind of thing, right? Like there is some value here, but I think we went overboard on doing that. Like if it is an interstitial or email or message or whatever that may be, that's also something that you kind of just want to be consistent across all platforms as much as possible. And also, hitting submit, all that. It should just be all kind of seamless. Like if a user's jumping around between an Android, an iPhone, and desktop, like you kind of just want it to work for them very seamlessly. And so it makes sense. And I think it goes back to, Jem, your point on the boundaries, like set those boundaries of like why you're doing it. What's the, why, what are you getting out of it? And then stop there. I love it. Any other things that we're missing on benefits, like like we obviously got the multiple devices and everything, but even are there certain use cases that we're completely missing that might still be very useful if you kind of set it in that boundary?
I think, and this is, and I'll call it a double-edged sword. I think SDUI at its best is fostering collaboration between everyone on your team. Everyone, I don't just mean your front-end engineers and your back-end engineers, but I really mean like your design partners, product, even data science. Because as you all work together to really understand the application you want to build, ship, track, measure, A/B test, the more you get together and map out what you want, like the less is lost in like the telephone conversation. Of course, that being said, when you get many people in a room or a Zoom call, like ideas just kind of start exploding, and suddenly it's harder and harder for us to kind of like focus on like the original goal versus all these things we want to do because it's awesome and shiny. But I think in my experience, one of the more fun times I had with CUI was actually just setting aside time to have like a brainstorming session with my design partner, because oftentimes like the design teams, they love what they do. They love building great user experiences, and I love like bringing that to life, like making it a reality. But sometimes there are things they want that I can't necessarily do, or there's a trade-off, like it won't ship in time. And SDUI is great because let's say it actually works and we are working within the constraints that we set. Now we don't have to like try to do too much. We can agree on what we can do in this iteration. Let's deploy it. And then in the meantime, let's figure out the next iteration. And then the holy grail promise is that it's server driven. I can swap it out in any time in the future. I don't have to have it immediately now. So yeah, back to what Jem said, I think what gets lost is also sounds like ambition. Ambition is holding us back.
Oh yeah. Well, I think it's even like, yeah, you do get ambitious, like even design systems, that one, like when Jem said that, I was like, yeah, that's exactly it. Is everyone's like, well, we need everything. Like, it's like, you could just start with that button and like everyone agree like that we should just have that consistency and just start there. But I think it's like everyone gets sold on like the end state where you could just have everything just controlled so easily, which you might get there, but also maybe don't try and get there. Like don't push to do that right off the start and just get a taste of it. And also it made me think when you said Zoom meetings, Sherman, it also made me start to think, wait, did it become even harder? Like we've talked a lot about like being remote, hybrid, this is a new thing for a lot of companies dealing with. And one of these things that I've seen time and time again is sometimes that in-person conversation can be very beneficial when you're going through some of that like back and forth with the designer or a technical, another engineer or PM, whatever it is. And Zoom calls do make it a little bit harder. It's the same thing as trying to go back and forth over Slack. It's just hard. And so I think like maybe we're losing some of that too. It's like actually getting harder because you have to have these conversations and they are more effective maybe in person. I'm sure there's people who disagree. Feel free to tweet at me and tell me that. But I have found that there's certain times that in-person meetings will be more effective. It's not to say you can't achieve it going back and forth on Slack or email or pull requests or on a video, but I think it just loses some of that translation over time. I don't know, maybe that's my rant about being like remote and hybrid.
No, I think you kind of hit it on the nail on the head, right? Like server-driven UI is hard. Engineering is hard. And to put server-driven UI on top of engineering, on top of remote work, you're communicating in a language that does not yet exist. And to even get backend and UI to see the same data requirements without server-driven UI is already challenging. And I think like as much as I've seen UI and backend try to understand each other, when it comes to server-driven UI, I'm of the opinion that the contracts need to be controlled by the UI. My perspective is when it comes to a successful server-driven UI application, the backend folks provide data to fulfill the UI, but the UI is responsible for composing itself, for understanding, does this data make sense in this context of this page? And I think what ends up happening is the relationship gets screwed up because it often is seen as a equal dynamic, but it's not equal because one person gets to throw data over the fence and the other person has to live with it. And so I think it's really important to get that relationship right, because to be successful at server-driven UI, you're thinking about your application in terms of components, whether it's view or data.
It's interesting. What you're trying to say is kind of like before it was like, hey, I handle the client stuff. You have this kind of implicit trust in me. You handle the backend stuff. I have this implicit trust in you. I don't question how you're fetching that data or doing any of the other way downstream things, But now it's kind of like on top of doing all that, you're also kind of doing my job too. And what am I left to do? Is that what you're kind of like getting towards?
Yeah, I think there's often a tension there where the backend people think they're composing the UI, but they're actually, in my opinion, just fulfilling it.
This is what I think I said this at the start. When done poorly, it's what a backend engineer thinks UI engineering it.
What you're saying too, Cole, is really smart in the sense that it's also like you're having to know more than you needed to know before in that contract. And that's not a bad thing. There's times where I'm like, no, it's really good to know, something on wherever that, like, there's some blurriness of like, you want to know a little bit of what's happening on the other end. but you don't want to know every little detail. And like a backend engineer doesn't want to know how every little myopic little interaction that happens on the UI that's going on. They don't care. There's like, it looks good, it works great. I don't care about how you're being performant, all those details, because that's a whole entire role. We should not think about every little detail. I mean, there's a lot of people out there, and probably a lot of our listeners who literally are just like full stack. They build client sites or whatever, and it's like all in. That's fine. That's great. But there's also times when you need to have specialization. And so that's maybe why it's getting more complicated too with SDUI, because there's not this nice divide. Yeah, you always have a little bit of blurriness, but there's not a nice divide at all.
You're right. And I just want to be fair to our backend engineers for a minute. It has nothing to do with ability. It has everything to do with, this is the area that I specialize in. I write this UI client. I understand the contracts that power it. And that's it. It's contracts-based development. And whether you're doing server-driven UI or just regular GraphQL, starting with a contract is a solid way to get something done.
I'm by no means think that I'm good enough to be backend engineer, Cole. So that's like, I think it goes both ways. I'm like, yeah, no, that's like, I could do it, but it's not going to be at the level that I expect someone who specializes in it.
Exactly.
Maybe before we dive into picks, I would love to, we've given some advice already for listeners, but like throughout this episode, I definitely there's a lot of good ones. But what's like a piece of advice that you would give someone who's thinking about leveraging SDUI in the next project, or maybe it's their team is thinking about that? What's some advice that you would have?
I think I can say this. If you or your team is considering SDUI because you think that it can replace the work of 3-4 engineers with one, that is kind of like the completely wrong way to go about it. But if you are considering it because you think it would unify your app experience across platforms and really kind of get everyone to buy in on a way of building an application, it is worth like investing in. And it's one of those things where it's like a snowball. Like initially it's really tiny, but as it goes through time and more people buy in and work together, it'll get bigger. So at the beginning, I think it's one of those things where it requires a lot of investment ahead of time before even writing a single piece of code, before even figuring out names for your DSL, your models. Sit down not just with each like engineer, but with your design team, with your product, and really like figure out what's like how we as an organization are going to do this, because it's not a magic bullet that was just going to solve everything and free the mobile developers from the app release cycle and review process. Yeah, I think that's the one thing that I would say.
Which, Sherman, maybe, sorry, I know I asked for everyone for advice on this, but I'm on the app like side of publishing, like, iOS and Android, they do have to go through reviews. Like even if you're Netflix or LinkedIn, if you're making changes, like there are reviewers on the apps like iOS and Apple side that's reviewing it. Is that totally true that you're getting completely bypassed and you could just do whatever you want in the, app stores with server-driven UI? I think the answer is no, but, so it's like, that's even to another point, right? It's not completely server-driven UI doesn't solve that problem.
Yeah, spot on. So I don't think there's anything that's going to get through that. And for good reason, those policies are in place because at the end of the day, Apple and Google want to make sure their users don't get taken advantage of by bad actors. On the flip side, what server-driven UI does help you as a company do is effectively A/B test your features within your app, because now instead of waiting for a user to update the app version, you could just send a different response from your server. And if your layout has been implemented before, then it can shift and show different experiences. This kind of solves the problem of where like a web app, you're kind of forced to have the latest version at all times. And a mobile phone, if I pull up my iPhone right now, I probably have a lot of very outdated apps. And I'm pretty sure those developers want me to press the install button, but I'm just too
That's a good point too. Yeah. So whereas like you don't have to worry about that. That is something that we didn't call out. So I like that you got to that as well. Any other advice that you all have, Cole, Augustus, Jem, that you would like to leave our listeners with?
Yeah, my advice would be one, listen to this episode, and don't fall for the green dragon. I don't know, making that up of server-driven UI. Like server-driven UI can be like as simple as complex as you want it to be. It can describe an entire page or just a component on that page. But like Sherman was saying, you need to have that understanding up front and say, this is what it's for, this is what it's not for. There are really powerful use cases for what server-driven UI does really well, and like it's good to research that and have that knowledge going in, versus falling for the temptation of the engineering trap of, but we can essentially build your own HTML, which is so tempting for really intelligent engineers. Pushing them off of that, again, it just takes discipline. So my advice is know what you're going into, have these strong understandings about what you're going to do and what you're not going to do.
I'll just reinforce something that was said earlier, which is like, if you are interested in doing it, starting incrementally. And that I think that's, honestly, I'll say that's true for majority of things, but you can't always have that because of whatever product, business reason, or whatever. But if you can, I think starting small and then working your way towards what that end goal is. I think it's like easy to say like, oh yeah, this is going to be amazing. It's going to be needing to update billions of times a day. So that's why we want to do it in one place in one shot. And then you end up like, oh, actually, we only need to update this every few times a month. And it's like, you over-engineered it for nothing, you know? And right? There's like a few places in Twitch where they utilize web views for stuff. And
that's hard.
I honestly don't think they update that often, truthfully, in terms of design. And that isn't to say that it wasn't necessary. They had other reasons why they wanted to do it from a team ownership perspective. Like, hey, we as a team, we have front-end engineers and back-end engineers, and we want to own this component, and we want it very standardized across everywhere, including the mobile and web. I feel like those are like very good reasons why. And, I think Sherman was kind of talking about it, like being aligned with product designers and your stakeholders. Like, that's such an important thing. But if you can't, start small, so work your way there,
I know like maybe listeners might listen to this episode and think negative thoughts towards SDUI, but I want to reinforce there are a lot of positives to it, and not even just from what it is as an architecture pattern, but everyone kind of like the meta stuff it brings, which going back is I think it's encouraging a lot of and fostering collaboration, especially up front. I don't think teams necessarily spend enough time just in planning phases before jumping in the code, right? And one other thing is I think it helps you really think about things outside of the immediate scope of your work. Like ever since we've kind of started doing things more SDUI, I've started considering when building clients, not just how I'm going to build this for web, but what's the experience going to look like in mobile, because I don't want to fall for the previous foot gun where we had fragmented experiences because the way a mobile developer thought one thing was different from the way a web developer thought. So now it's really nice because it helped me reinforce this pattern where I realize I want my users, how they access the experience, to be the same no matter what platform they use. And if I truly believe that statement, I need to commit myself to understanding how those platforms work as well.
I love that, Sherman. That's so good. I think though, what the takeaway there too is, how do you foster more of that, right? Like, how do you foster more of the conversations and understanding on how like each of your applications behave? I don't think you necessarily have to go the SDUI route, right? Like, it's like, how do we just do that more? And that might be the problem you're trying to solve, right? I think too often as engineers, we're so guilty of this. It's like, oh, this will solve all of our problems. And we just kind of dive in, when it's like, wait, what problem are we trying to solve? And if you're like Sherman, that might be legitimately a problem, is like our user experience is very fragmented, like between iOS and Android. They're kind of similar, but web, it just feels so different, and it shouldn't. It's like, how do you foster that? Well, server-driven UI could be an answer, but there's also like other ways. It's like, oh, well, we need to talk more. It's like, like start to do that. But I love that kind of was a forcing factor. Like, it just kind of organically that helped have more meaningful conversation.
Yeah, that and realizing there is a lot of limitations to just storing all your state in query params.
do not do that, is what you're saying. Well, but there again, maybe there's boundaries, right? Like, but then it's a slippery slope. I know how that boundary works because it's like, well, it's just one more Mercury pram, like just one more, it's fine.
It really is a slippery slope. Like from hearing all of your advice, I feel like what I'm walking away with is if you asked me on the last episode, I would say, yeah, go do server-driven UI. And I know we've talked about the negatives and the positives, and yes, it's easier to compose universal experiences across platforms, and it can help increase your time to market. But I think my advice changing on this episode is don't do it. For most people listening, you probably don't need server-driven UI, and it's not that it's too advanced or it's too complex. It's probably just not a good fit for your use case. If you're not having these same problems where, start on one platform, start on iPhone, get it universal to Android, get that same design language working on both of those platforms. Do that before you bring in web. Do that before you bring in something else. Because as Ryan said, this problem is a slippery slope. Because we're talking in abstracts about our applications in ways that we haven't before, it's easy to just spiral out and just do nothing and burn out. So don't do it.
All right. So Cole's advice is don't do it. I love, because it was more positive Cole and like the couple years ago, that last episode, which is cool. I'm not hating on that, Cole. It's like, that is actually a good thing to celebrate. It's like you try something and you learn from it, and like to revisit and do that, I think is awesome. So yeah, it's not a shot at you for that. I think it's an awesome thing where it's like, wow, that I learned wasn't the right route for me.
I've been very bullish on server-driven UI, and I still am to some degree, but I think just what I've seen in practice, everything that people have said today just happens everywhere, and it's not like HTML, it's not like JSX. You don't just do it. So yeah, ship something, build something, and half the time you'll do it faster than if you do it in server-driven UI.
That's a great point. All right. Well, it's probably a good time for us to dive into picks. I don't think server-driven UI is a pick in this episode, but who knows? You just never know. We did lose Jem. He just got back from vacation, so he told me he didn't have any picks to share. So, send him Valley Silicon picks. He needs more to share with all of you. Cole, you want to start it off?
Yes, my first pick for today is, as somebody who struggles to do any kind of interior design, I need help. So I found this really cool website called Wallism. They do tailor-made wallpaper and murals. And so behind me is a blank white wall. I hope by the next time we record, it'll be a really nice indigo ocean blue mural that is more interesting. And that is my only pick for today.
Right on. I'm excited to see your new background. I think that will be really cool. That's cool that you can kind of just create your own too.
They do custom sizes too, like you can print to your wall.
Right on. That is actually, that's pretty badass.
That's awesome.
Actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wonder if there's a limit on the size. Now I'm curious, but it's still, I'm sure most standard walls, like, they're probably targeting. That's pretty cool. All right, Augustus, what do you have for us?
Yeah, I have two picks. One somewhat related to the topic today. It's well, I guess in general, Apollo GraphQL docs, they have a section for tech notes, which they just kind of at a high level talk about like different types of things, and server-driven UI basics was one. In that article, I recommend that, but in that article, there's also like this discussion of demand-oriented schema design. And, if you've ever done GraphQL, like take it once, you have to be very mindful of how you design your schema, and especially like working at Twitch, like microservices, you might have take it once, whatever you want to return, and then figuring out how that maps to GraphQL and then backs to clients is something you have to have a lot of intentional thought about. And very many times it really comes down to what is being populated on the UI. And so I thought it was a really great read of demand-oriented schema design. My second pick is this app called POV.camera. That's literally the website. The use case is, you know how like there's like those disposable cameras where you take a picture and take it once and then you get a certain amount and then you're done. Basically, someone made an app for it. I think what's really interesting about this app, the one thing I freaking hate is every time someone has one of these apps, you have to go download the app. And I haven't figured out how they do it, but there's this QR code that when you go to an event, so I went to a wedding, they scan it, and it literally took me, I had to sign in with my Apple ID, but that was really the only thing. And then it takes me straight into the app. Maybe it's a progressive web app. I haven't really dug into it. It's probably what it is, right? And it felt like such a seamless, like, oh my God, thank goodness I didn't have to download another dumb app just to like, because you don't want to be that guy that says, oh, hey, loved your wedding, but I didn't want to download the app. You don't want to be that guy. But so yeah, I thought it was a cool.
I figured that was the use case, was the weddings. Like that's exactly where my head went. And you're right, Augustus, like that barrier to just download. I don't know. It's like, and I've been to a lot of weddings too, where the internet's maybe a little shoddy. And so like, if you just kind of get that bad spot, I mean, you might still have that with trying to hit the progressive web app, but like it just feels a lot more seamless. I like that a lot. I also thought like my prediction, I don't know, years ago, I don't know when it was that we would move away from apps a lot sooner. I know there's a lot of reasons for some of the dedicated apps, but just having more web-based things is just kind of, I mean, it kind of goes with this topic on server-driven UI. So Augustus, I love that you brought that up. That's cool. All right, Sherman, what do you have to share with our listeners?
Yeah, I think first off, I want to say shout out to Augustus for that. I'm definitely stealing that recommendation because me and my wife are having a reception later this year, and that was that was not a thing that I was thinking about. Whether our guests would have good Wi-Fi at the venue. So awesome. But yeah, for me. I have 2 picks, not related to today's conversation, but just general picks. One is there is a mini series out on HBO Max called The Sympathizer. It is a adaptation of a book of the same name, and I would highly recommend it because it was it is better books I've read recently, and the TV show so far has been great. And my second pick is another show, actually. It is a British show, almost the equivalent of Jeopardy, but very English and posh. It's called University Challenge. I was introduced to it by a friend of the pod, Tony Edwards. And I've been binging episodes while working, just in the background, trying to keep up with these very, very, very smart kids that are going to like Oxford or Cambridge. And yeah, we just saw the most recent season's finale together. It was great. Would recommend it if you enjoy trivia. That's almost Eurocentric, so maybe a bit more upscale. I don't know. But yeah, great stuff.
That's awesome. I need more TV recommendations, so this is awesome. I appreciate that a lot. That's always good. I just have one pick for the episode. It was actually music related, which like I feel like because Stacy couldn't make it tonight, I almost have to like, make up for her not being here. There's a new album the hip hop artist Classified released called Luke's View. He hasn't released anything in like 4 years. This is like someone I'd listened to kind of growing up over the years, and so it's kind of cool to just keep following the music. So I was excited to see him release a new one. It's been really good so far. I've listened to it a couple times. So yeah, check that one out. Sherman, thank you so much for joining us on this episode. I think it was such a cool way to revisit something that, we talked about years ago as like it was a new trend, and then us revisiting it as companies have adopted it. And so thank you so much for joining us and kind of sharing your thoughts on that. Where can people get in touch with you?
They follow me on Twitter or X _Shermango. Can't say that I'm very active on that platform. If you'd like to, I don't know, connect with me on LinkedIn, maybe that's the.
I was waiting for it. I was like, it's got to be called out.
That's what I was
Yeah.
like, he's got him up at work.
Hey, I'll definitely respond quicker on that platform because I am pretty much on it 24/7.
That's fair.
Not lying.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us. It was awesome having you on. If people want to find us, kind of how to find us on whatever you like to listen to podcasts on. We are on YouTube. Definitely doing more video, like we said this year. It's been fun doing more of that. You can find us on Twitter. I don't think it's called X. I'm pretty sure it's still Twitter at frontendhh. Any last words, you all?
Play content warning. If you ever if you ever wanted to be a social media influencer, that should be your gateway.
It's a game.
Yeah, it's a game like what's that other one? The dangerous game, the Backrooms.
Lethal Company. Yeah.
Lethal Company. Yeah. So it's basically it's four of you. You go down into a dungeon and you film each other getting scared the shit out of with the monsters, and it's honestly it's like Paranormal Activity, but like co-op. It's scary.
Actually, kind of sounds interesting. Yeah.
It's great because it is a perfect example of what social media clout is about. Risking your life for internet fame.
15 minutes, man. That's all you got to get. It's that 15 minutes of fame.
It's funny, Ryan, when you were talking about your pick and Stacy, I remembered when Jem was talking about Stacy's music picks, and he was like, yeah, I'm playing some island funk. I don't want to say the full thing because only Jem can do, but it was awesome.
Oh yeah, Jem did a good job of like describing. She always has amazing descriptions of the songs, and I don't know that Classified would fit her descriptions of like maybe she can do a good job of it. I'm not sure, but yeah, it's not technically the music that she would usually listen to, but you know, it's a music.